Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to my show for the second installment of this series on coronavirus. This episode is going to focus on what's going on in New York. If you guys haven't heard, New York is currently experiencing an outbreak, which is pretty bad. Over the last 24 hours, almost 100 people died in the state, and one hospital in particular, Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, made headlines because 13 patients died there overnight. This installment is a little bit personal for me just because I did my residency in New York City, specifically at Coney Island Hospital, which ironically is a sister hospital of that hospital that made headlines. The stories and reports that I'm getting are based off of what's in the news, but also social media accounts of my former friends and colleagues who are literally in the front lines battling this virus. Some topics I wanted to cover were why New York? Why is New York experiencing this severe outbreak? And what are some take-home points that we in other parts of the country can take away from this? So firstly, New York is the largest and densest city and metropolitan area in the United States. In fact, New York has twice the density of Chicago and Philadelphia and 3 times the density of Los Angeles. In addition, because there are so many people living in such tight quarters with each other, it was bound that people are going to get sick just simply because of being so packed together. Another reason is public transportation. New York City has the most developed public transportation system in the entire United States. And a lot of New Yorkers don't own cars and rely on the mass transit system to get around and go to work and whatnot. Oftentimes in rush hour, people can be packed in shoulder to shoulder trying to get back home from work. A third reason is most New Yorkers live in apartments, which really make everything much more tight and compact. A fourth reason would be that New York is having a lot of cases simply because the state is testing so many people. But that doesn't necessarily explain why the death rate there is so high. Another major factor is that there was a relatively slow early response to everything that's going on. Specifically on March 2nd, New York had its first confirmed case of community spread, meaning not from somebody who had traveled from somewhere outside. And the state and the city had a really slow response. It took them up until the 18th to shut down public schools. But by that time, it appeared that the virus kind of had gotten out of control. And a lot of people are contrasting this to what happened in California, specifically in the Bay Area, where there was a widespread lockdown pretty early. And they're contrasting that with why California's cases are so low in comparison. So another point that is not really being talked too much about in the media, but something I have a little bit more of a personal history with. So New York City really is a kind of a situation that kind of really encapsulates everything that's kind of wrong with our economy and our healthcare system, namely that it's a 2-tiered health system. On the one hand, you have these really amazing world-class institutions like NYU, Mount Sinai, etc., that see patients who mostly have private insurance. And for a lot of people in other countries, they might not understand that, but in America, you don't have to have insurance and the government doesn't cover everybody. And then on the other hand, you have a lot of the second tier, the lower tier, which is the public hospital system, specifically New York Health and Hospitals, which serves mostly Medicaid patients who are low income and the uninsured. Specifically, my hospital, Coney Island Hospital, was seeing 80% of their patients were either Medicaid or uninsured. Which also kind of, goes to the point that really the people who are going to suffer the most in this crisis are the poor and the vulnerable. So the problem with New York's public hospital system is is that it's very underfunded and understaffed. In fact, I have a lot of honestly horror stories from my residency at Coney Island Hospital. For example, for a roughly 300-bed hospital, we only had one MRI machine, if you can believe that. And typically a routine MRI, which normally should be done within 24 hours, would take sometimes 3 days, sometimes even more, depending on availability. We had 2 CT scans, one that was constantly breaking down. We also were limited on phlebotomists, respiratory therapists. Nurses were overworked, and there was so many problems there. It was just so, unfathomable to anybody who works in any other type of setting. If they were to really go into it, they would see it was such a disaster. So considering how already unstable that healthcare system was, it was really, coronavirus coming there was like the perfect storm. You have population density, public transit, people living in apartments, and also this really poor healthcare infrastructure, this two-tiered system, and it was bound to have a crisis like this. So what are some take-home points that we in the rest of the country can really take from this? The first is that density really matters. New York, being the most dense city in our country, is probably going to be the hardest hit. And that doesn't necessarily mean that other cities aren't going to be. In fact, we're already getting some case reports from New Orleans and Detroit that there's beginning to be outbreaks in those cities as well. But I do suspect that every city in the country is going to get affected, and eventually, once the cities start to get experience those outbreaks, it's going to start to spread towards the interior, into rural areas, specifically like the hospital I practice at. Another point is that I do suspect that, like with any crisis, it's going to be the poor and the vulnerable and the weakest among us who are going to be the most affected, which is kind of really unfortunate. But that's just how, it is in this country and, in general. But my thoughts and prayers are really, out there for, my friends, my colleagues, and everybody else in New York. I've been kind of down these past couple of days just thinking about them. I know I'm trying to make a channel that's much more up and positive, but, sometimes you can't be, especially in crisis times like these. But, there are a lot of websites out there where you can help people in New York and whatnot. So, if you found this video interesting or enlightening, please like this video and please subscribe, and thank you for watching.